A very warm welcome to you. My name is Tim Ruffer. I'm the head of publishing at the Royal School of Church Music. So it gives me great pleasure to welcome you to this, the third and final session on composing for the Harold Smart composition competition. I don't know. I've been on holiday, so I don't know whether or not people have mentioned the whole concept of the Harold Smart competition, but it was founded by um, a, um, a doctor back in the 1980s who was a very keen amateur musician. He left in his will a legacy to provide for an annual composition competition, specifically for average church choirs, average parish choirs. So the rules stipulate that it is no more than four parts. So it may not you may not divide or have four parts plus descant. It is literally just four parts, and the organ part or accompaniment uh, should be very approachable and not too complicated, sort of round about the grade 5 or 6 level. And over the years, we've had some wonderful compositions which remain in the catalogue, and probably the most famous, I think, is the John Madden "We Will Remember Them," which certainly my choir does quite often on Remembrance Sunday most years. So that's a little bit about the competition itself. If you've been here before, you'll have listened to, you've been with Alexander Lestrange talking about harmony, and Joanna Forbes Lestrange, who was talking about melody. And if you missed those, they will be available on our YouTube site very shortly, if they're not already there. But today it gives me great pleasure to welcome Stephen Bullamore. Stephen, as well as being on the editorial panel where we decide what we're going to publish as the RSCM publishing arm, is also the director of music at St Mary Magdalene, Newark, and runs a number of choirs in the Nottinghamshire area, and composes himself and arranges and actually publishes. I think was the post-Renaissance music. I'm quite sure. Restoration music, the specialization of restoration music. So I think that's enough from me, and over to Stephen, who will talk to us about having heard about melody and harmony, we now hear about the accompaniment, and also how to work with choral parts. And anyway, I'll leave it to Stephen, who will be able to tell us more.
Thank you very much indeed, Tim. Yeah, I spend quite a lot of my time arranging music. I do write a little bit, but not very much. I spend a lot more time working with pre-existing tunes and melodies and pieces. My last big arranging project was actually to arrange piano parts to be played on 101 pianos simultaneously, which was quite good fun. But that's probably not all that helpful for our purposes today. I'm going to share my screen, and I'm just going to talk you through a few pieces. Some will be quite well known, I'm sure. Some will be less well known. And we're going to kind of start with a Victorian stroke Edwardian type thing. So I'm hoping that everybody can see Bruin D up on the screen. This is published by the RSCM, although this is not their edition, I have to confess, because I didn't have it scanned in. But what you can see here, the composer has taken the choir parts and they are singing in octaves. This is a really useful piece at the start of term, I find, when the choir is perhaps recovering from a summer recess or recovering from Christmas, and they are needing something where they can support each other. And all the harmony here, you can see, goes into the organ part. And it's quite a thick texture. This is something which was very popular in the late 19th, early 20th centuries, to have this thick texture. But I think one of the things that is worth noticing is there is still a gap. I don't know if you can see my cursor moving here. This gap between, if you like, the tenor part in the organ and the pedal. If you start pushing tenor parts down and start having very thick writing low down in the organ, it can sound very muddy indeed. And this is already quite a thick texture that you can see here. Also worth noting, this would not be suitable for submission to this competition. This is too hard. All these multi-note chords in the organ are really quite taxing on the organist. It's very difficult to maintain the legato through this passage at the end of the line and all of those sorts of things. But what you can see is the way the organ supports the voices and the voices support each other. So if I can work out how to change my piece that we're looking at, because my control panel's in the way. There we go. So again, we're in the Edwardian era. This is by Sir Edward Bairstow, and this is a more complex organ part in many ways. This is Lord Thou Hast Been Our Refuge, and you can see the way he starts just with this single note and then very quickly builds up this texture. It's a very and it gets again really quite thick and involved. But then just down at the bottom of the first page, once the choir parts are in, they become self-supporting, and it's kind of harmony there in its own right. So there's a little bit less going on. I think it's worth saying something very, very early on about the difference between the piano and the organ. So many of us have pianos or keyboards at home, and it's very easy to kind of sit down and play something on the piano and think, oh, that works really well. Sometimes it translates well to the organ, sometimes a little bit less so. And I'm minded of, I used to teach techniques of composition at Bangor University, and we were centred on the music of Mozart and Haydn. And you look at their piano sonatas and you find endless examples of Alberti bass. So you find the left hand is playing these broken chords, arpeggios. And then you go into the string quartets, you get occasional bits of Alberti bass, but the much more common one is to have the texture, is to have the lower voices playing syncopated rhythms. So the second violin, the viola, the cello, playing these cha 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 da 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 da. If you put that onto the piano, it doesn't work so well. If you take the Alberti bass from the piano and put it into a string quartet, it can work, but it's used more sparingly. So I always like to kind of think about what is the actual instrument that I'm working with here. And here's an example of some editing work I've been doing for somebody recently. And this hasn't been published yet, so I won't tell you exactly what it is. You can see, obviously, it's a setting of the holly and the ivy. And the task here was to create versions which were suitable for piano and suitable for organ. So here's the piano version, and you can see at the beginning here you've got this little roll in the left hand, and then this arpeggiated left hand supported by use of the sustaining pedal here. And then the mezzo-soprano soloist sits on top. So just take a moment to look through those first couple of lines and see. You can see this is very pianistic writing with the arpeggios going up and down. And how do we translate this over onto organ? Well, first of all, that opening figure, we just put a straight pedal note down. There's very little value in a tremolo on the organ. It can be used as a special effect, but you'll find it's you don't get the same kind of build-up of sound in the same way that you do on the piano. Again, the arpeggios have gone into the left hand, but they've been simplified in here. It just doesn't cut through the sound in the same way. And then you can see on this lower system here, the long held pedal with the arpeggios then split between the hands, which makes life quite a lot easier than trying to do them in one hand. And the sustained nature has to come in the pedal, because of course we don't have a sustaining pedal on the organ. I think it's worth reiterating this business about about the distance between parts low down. This is a piece often sung in Advent by John Stainer, and you can see the organ part is fairly blocky. It's supporting the vocal lines as they come in. Slightly unusual for the period in having this contrapuntal texture in the vocal parts, with each part layering on in turn. But this chordal accompaniment from the organ, and it's very much driven by this chromatic bass line here, which is quite fun. But you can see it, the lower down the bass note is in the pedals, the further it is from the tenor. It's only when we get kind of up into the higher octave here and here that the voices come closer together. And you can see how that all fits together. Later on in the piece, as we go on to the last page, you can see these, somebody's got their big organ markings in here, but you can see these big block chords, again, pedal and tenor safely separated, but these big block chords supporting the choir. So I would urge you to think about how can your organ port support the choir. It doesn't necessarily have to double it all the time. And there's a really good example of that from Benjamin Britten. So I think you may be familiar with these words for the competition, in fact. So don't copy exactly what he does. But you can see here you've got this, what's known as a heterophonic texture. So you've got a melody which is decorated simultaneously. So you can see the sopranos and tenors here are almost moving in octaves, and they're supported by the left hand of the organ here. And then you've got this filigree passage work over the top. And then the sopranos and tenors get a rest, and the altos and basses pick it up. And again, they're supported by the organ down here, with the passage work going over the top. Britten also uses texture to actually help define the structure of the piece. So as we get through to the end of this section, you can see this little flourish coming down in the organ part, and then this static chord, which is just used to support the voices in here. So, just moving forward in time a little bit, we've got here Philip Ledger's Sussex Carol on Christmas night. I thought since we're in the middle of December that would be quite a nice little thing to look at. Again, this time we're printed on 3 staves, which organists are sometimes grateful for, particularly when the left hand is high up here, as you can see. And notice the directions to the organist. Put in brackets, suggesting that the right hand should be highlighted as against the left hand. All organs are different, and this is part of the challenge of being an organist. So I suggest not being too prescriptive with the registrations that you offer to organists. Sometimes moods are useful to have, and you'll see that in a moment, but something which kind of suggests I want this bit to be a little bit louder than this can be quite useful as well. And you can see here the left hand plays chords in various different inversions. The right hand's got this little bit of passage work coming through here. And then once the soprano starts with the famous tune, they're supported, but the part isn't doubled. So you can see here the organ gives loads of support here, but the parts they're left to sing for themselves. And that's a choice that you can make. as to whether or not you think it needs to be doubled. Sometimes it's worth having the organ kind of cutting in and out of that melody part. Then here, when the tenors and basses take over the melody, it's the same harmony in the organ, but this time the pedal has been brought in. Now, unless you describe it otherwise, an organist is going to assume that the pedals act rather like double basses in the orchestra, or double basses and cellos together. So playing at what we call 8-foot pitch, which is the pitch you'd expect, if you like, and 16-foot pitch, an octave lower. That's what's normal on the organ. So here you can see that the organ part just gets underneath the tenors and bass parts simply by using the pedal and getting that into 16-foot pitch. And then one of my favourite organ textures, simply lose the organ part and allow the choir to sing unaccompanied. Only for 5 bars, so they haven't been abandoned forever, and they are quickly brought back into line on the next line. So I'm just going to show you one or two things that I've been working on. This is one of my favourite Christmas carols, which I arranged a couple of years ago, and it's published by the RSCM, so well worth investigating. I don't suppose you'll be learning it this side of Christmas, but certainly worth investigating for next year. And this was actually written for a bigger choir, but I have performed it with my church choir, and indeed will be doing so in just a few days' time. So you can see here the organ part is actually quite stark. We start in octaves, then adding in the 5th. And the way I've used the organ part here is just to give the choir a little shove every now and again. So the choir start just in bar 5 here, and the organ abandons them momentarily and then just kind of keeps them moving through that 6/8 bar. And then I was obviously feeling benevolent towards the sopranos and altos. They're left on their own for a few bars, and then the organ here is used to support the tenors and basses without doubling them. You can see I like to put quite a lot of detail in my organ parts, quite a lot of articulation detail. It seems to be the modern way. We don't like to leave too much open to performers' interpretation, and I think it's good when I'm working with living composers, when I'm performing their music. I quite often call them up or invite them into a rehearsal and say, what do you really mean here? Where does this phrase end? What's going on? Let's get it into the score. Here you can see the altos have got the tune momentarily, and the organ part is surrounding them. So it's got a note above, a note below, and then it's kind of shadowing them in the inner voice. So it provides this little halo of sound around the altos. And then things get a little bit more busy for the organist here. But again, notice I'm keeping this tenor and bass part in the organ nicely separated out. And again, you can see lots and lots of detail in the parts there. Here, I've used the organ texture to define different verses. So you've got a much calmer approach here. No filigree passage work, no kind of percussive chords, if you like. These are just nice and smooth chords supporting the organ. So it provides an aural contrast for the listener. And then we go back into the same sort of thing that we had earlier on. Moving on, really just wanting to focus here on some of the instructions that I've given to the organist. I hope you can read these. We'll zoom in a little bit. So I've suggested here that the right hand could be played on open flutes. I like that kind of hollow sound. Now, an organist may well kind of go, well, I haven't got one of those, so I'll just use whatever I've got, and that's fine, of course it is. And you can see for the left hand, I've put kind of things in brackets. It's kind of, if it works, add a 16-foot in, so you've got that left hand providing warmth at a lower octave. If it works, maybe a bit of 4-foot, but definitely some 8-foot. So, and you can see this is reinforced with the dynamics in the organ part, so that the right hand is just a little bit more prominent in comparison to the left hand, and then the pedal 16-foot and 8-foot, as you would expect, just providing a little bit of foundation to the overall harmony in here. This is quite a short piece, so the texture doesn't really vary at all, and I think that's worth noting. If you're working on a fairly small canvas, do you really need to be changing the texture every 5 bars? You know, think about how can you provide unity through the piece. What else have I got to show you here? Ah yes, here's another Adventy piece, the Angel Gabriel, and this was written for an occasion with a very small choir, and we simply divided into upper and lower voices. That's something that you might want to think about if you're writing for a small choir, upper voices and lower voices. And you can see I've deliberately given the option for the lower voices either to sing at the printed pitch or an octave lower, which is in fact how the first performance worked. And here the left hand of the organ just starts with the main melody, da 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 da, by way of an introduction. And I said earlier I like descriptions, so I've suggested the left hand could go on some sort of crumble. And then this really woolly pedal part, as woolly as a Christmas jumper. This, in fact, this was first played by a grade 6 organist who I was teaching at the time, and it was sung by his sixth form fellow singers, and the part was written for him to be able to play, and he quite liked wearing his Christmas jumper for this. And just a little challenge to him, rather than having the bass note right on the front of the beat here, you can see I've just pushed it round to the back of the beat. I would stress that it's not at all a reflection on his playing and his habit of playing the pedals slightly behind the rest, but it's just a kind of way of driving things through. Very few organs actually have a 32-foot pedal stop. Nice if you do, but if you've got a nice, if you put it in there, then the organist will know that you're looking for that kind of extra warmth and depth to it. The idea of this was to sound like a whole symphony orchestra of double basses and cellos playing pizzicato underneath everything else, so thinking quite orchestrally here. What else have I got to show you? Yeah, here's a little introduction where it's a special effect, not available on all organs, but you can see I've suggested only 4-foot in the pedals. Sorry, there we go, let's zoom in a bit. So only 4, so that is going to sound up an octave from where it's printed, which means it's going to be sounding only an octave away from this right hand flute melody here. And you've got this halo of sound from the strings. Now, of course, if this was on the piano, this sustained note is simply unfeasible. You'd have to be repeated to be heard. So, big difference between the organ and the piano is the way the sound decays. It's certainly worth thinking about. Here you can just see these block chords I've suggested reads if they are available. Let's see what else we've seen on these. Here we go. This seems to be one of my favourite textures, this quasi-pizzicato thing. And you can see in here the two hands are in fact overlapping. This is a nightmare for a rehearsal accompanist to play on the piano. They don't like it when I make them do it. But on the organ, it all swims into focus because you can push the right hand. In fact, I've said even 16 foot, so it's quite a thick, gloopy right hand coming through here. But then the left hand is just highlighting this C major arpeggio initially, and then the pedal again, quasi pizzicato, like thinking orchestrally, like a double bass working its way through. In this piece, I have used texture to define the structure a little bit, so you can see this texture goes all the way through to about here, and then suddenly it changes, and we've got slightly more conventional, I suppose, figuration, if you like, with the chords in the left hand. The pedal still has this this similar figure, but the texture has changed in the manual parts so that it can work its way through in there. And here we go, we've got the left hand. This is, again, descriptive words. Glittering is quite a useful word, I think, or bright, I could have written. So we've got this arpeggiated figure going through the right hand, and then the left hand, again, I've just tried to shy away from putting everything on the beat. So it still supports the choir, but it just gives a little bit of aural interest. You can see this working across the beat here. This piece was written for Epiphany, and so why impious Herod shouldst thou fear, and I seem to have been channeling my inner Adams family here. This would not be kind to give to a grade 5 or 6 organist. It would probably at least need to be in a different key with all of these flats, but you can see here I've just, it's almost like a piano texture or a guitar texture. You've got the bass note coming in and then 2 chords. This could be simplified, but you've got these chords on the second and third beats of the bar. There's almost an element of the kind of theatre organ about this texture coming through here. And as I recall, yes, so for this second verse, the soloists are more or less on their own. It's the 3 wise men, of course, the sages from the east, and then just little decorative flourishes on the organ coming through. And then we go back to the fairground type texture coming through here to support the next thing. So again, texture is defining the structure in many ways here. I wonder if it's useful for me just to take any questions, since we've just not got very much time in here. I'm very happy to take any questions. I don't know if anything occurs to you, Tim.
I think it's very interesting about your giving clear instructions about what sort of texture, rather than a sort of general mood of what you're after, rather than specific reads and what have you. I remember there's a particular set of responses, which I think it was the Lord's Prayer, where the composer asks for it to be flowing like a Parisian sewer. And I don't know if you've ever been to Paris, that they have this wonderful system of sort of letting water out at the top of the road, and it sort of gurgles down the road and washes down into the sewer. I think that's what he was after, and it's sort of you can imagine it gurgling away down the hill. But it's as you say, a lot of churches don't have a my church organ has 13 stops, and
Yep.
so it's quite limited. It's very very workable and very lovely organ, but it hasn't got a big reed on the grate or anything, and so it's you have to work with what you have, and giving too much demands on the organist is always going to be a tricky thing. Now, have we got anything in? Okay. Anybody got any chats that they would like to ask? Put in the chat for Stephen, even if it's no, would be useful. Well, I found that I hope everybody else has found that very interesting. I really did, and hopefully when you're putting together your composition um, for the competition, you'll bear some of that in mind and think about how best you can uh, accompany and supporting the vocal lines is very important. If your organ part is completely divorced from what you're wanting the choir to sing, it makes it so difficult. And you will be uh, I think I'm pretty sure that the adjudicators will take a dim view of that. So just bear that in mind, that the organ part has got to be um, a good has to work with the vocal parts, not against them. But I think, as somebody said, most of your examples were too tricky, probably for the competition, as you said at the beginning.
Quite,
But
quite a few
yeah,
are on the tricky side. So yes.
but it does it does give an idea of what works and what doesn't work, and I think that's the important lesson that Stephen was teaching us there. But I think that is probably about it. Um, and as I said earlier, this is the final of the three lunch and learn sessions. I hope that they have all given you food for thought, and we have already we've already had some people send in their submissions, which I find slightly worrying in that we've specifically gone out of our way to provide you with some top tips from top people, for which we're so grateful. And hopefully that you're having had the benefit of Stephen and everybody else's uh, experience. It'll hopefully improve your compositions. Um, Question there from Ed Macaulay, Stephen.
Yes. Yeah. Absolutely.
Piano writing.
For piano writing, do similar principles apply in terms of whether to support the choir rhythmically or duplicate their notes? I think absolutely yes. I think one of the things about piano writing, I find when I'm playing for rehearsals, for example, chorister only rehearsals, I sometimes find myself putting in extra notes to help them subdivide the beat, and that can be quite useful for a choir. So if the choir has, let's say, is singing in 4/4 and they've got a nice long semi-brief to sing, then actually having the choir do something having the piano do something during that semi-brief can be quite useful. I'm sure they're all watching the conductor anyway, but it can be quite useful in terms of keeping them together through that long note, to have some motion in the piano parts, whether that be simply going up and down an arpeggio on that chord, or whether it can be adding some more harmonic interest through some pulsing dissonance, is a matter of taste. But absolutely. Are the composers allowed to write for piano in this competition, Tim, or is
Yep.
it organ only? It's
Yep.
piano as an option. So yeah, do separate them out in your minds as very separate instruments that happen to share a common interface in terms of a keyboard. It's a very, very different sound world.
Very much so. Yes, you haven't got.
And the other thing with
The organ, of course, is the king of instruments for a reason, in that it does have a wide variety of textures and sounds that you can get out of it.
I think the other thing with the piano is it's much easier to do rapid crescendos and diminuendos, because you're so physically attached to the instrument, where an organist has to be able to plan those in terms of adding stops. So sometimes when I'm writing an organ part, I will create a crescendo by simply increasing the number of notes in a chord. Whereas with the piano, you can be much more sort of in and out, if you like, and sforzados are much more effective, and that sort of thing. Albert has a question about: would the text you're setting the music to affect whether you use piano or organ? It's for me, it's more often about the resources which are going to be available for the first performance. To be honest,
Mm.
it's which is possibly not helpful in terms of this competition. But yeah, have a think about what effect in what way are you going to illustrate the words, in what way are you going to capture the meaning of the text, and therefore, if you are given the choice, what is the best instrument to be able to do that for you?
It's I mean, obviously, the words given are words from the Psalms, and if you go to a church where they sing Anglican chant, it's often very interesting how the organist will illustrate the words in the psalm, and especially we're blessed here in Salisbury with a fantastic organist in the cathedral, John Challenger, who really brings the psalms to life purely by the uh, I mean, obviously, he's limited to the chords of the Anglican chants, but there are so many so many stops to choose from on the Salisbury organ that if you're talking about the Leviathan or you know um, sheep in the fields or birds in the sky, there's such a wide variety of organ stops that you can use to illustrate that, and that might well be reflected in the text that you've got to work with here. Um, which might possibly be easier than if you were writing it with the piano in mind. Thank you, David. I'm not sure what tuts are, but I'm sure they're very good. Um, and thank you for your appreciation. When we decided to put these lunch and learn sessions on, we weren't sure whether we'd get anybody tutorials. Whether we get anybody coming to them. So I'm very grateful, firstly, to you for joining us, and secondly, especially to Stephen for being a wonderful tutor to us all, and giving us some really great insights on your accompaniment for your compositions. And I look forward to seeing uh, uh, the results of your labours. So I think unless anybody has anything else to say, I'll draw it to a close. Thank you all very much for attending, and good luck.